Before we begin this journey, I want to warn you that some stories need to be told, even when they break our hearts. What you're about to hear is the remarkable tale of survival against impossible odds, a testimony to the human spirit's capacity to endure darkness and still find light. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps me so much. And take a moment to comment where you're watching this life story from. My name is Margaret Ruth Thompson, though everyone calls me Miss Maggie now. I'm 83 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm ready to share the story that shaped me. When people see a sweet old lady with silver hair and gentle hands, they don't imagine the battles I've fought. But truth be told, every wrinkle on my face has earned its place. It was 1947 when my world shattered for the first time. I was just 7 years old, living in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. We weren't rich by any means, but Mama made sure our home was filled with love. She had a way of turning the simplest things into magic. An old flour sack became a beautiful dress with her skilled hands, and leftover cornmeal transformed into the most delicious cornbread you ever tasted. Mama worked as a housemaid for a wealthy white family across town. Each morning before dawn, she'd press her only good dress, pin her hair carefully under her scarf, and kiss my forehead goodbye. "Be good for your daddy, little bird," she'd whisper, her breath warm against my cheek. "I'll be home before the stars come out." That particular summer day started like any other. The cicadas were singing their endless song, and the air hung heavy with humidity. I was playing with a rag doll Mama had made me when Mrs. Harris from next door came running up our dirt path, her face streaked with tears. I remember how time seemed to slow as she knelt before me, her hands trembling as they gripped my shoulders. "Child," she said, her voice breaking, "there's been an accident at the Carter house where your mama works." The details came later in hushed whispers not meant for a child's ears. Mama had fallen down the grand staircase while polishing the banister, or at least that's what the Carter family claimed. Years later, I would learn from another maid who was there that day that Mrs. Carter had pushed her in a fit of rage over a broken teacup, a priceless family heirloom, they said, as if any object could be worth a human life. The funeral was held 3 days later. I wore the blue Sunday dress Mama had finished sewing just the week before. It was too big, she'd made it for me, to grow into a future she wouldn't be part of. The church was packed with people from our community, their faces solemn as the preacher spoke of heaven and God's mysterious ways. I didn't understand much of what he said. I was too focused on the simple wooden coffin at the front of the church, trying to comprehend how my Mama, so full of life and love, could be lying still inside it. Daddy stood beside me, his face a stone mask. He didn't cry, not at the church, not at the burial, not even when we returned to our empty house. That night, after our neighbors had left with their covered dishes and condolences, he sat at our kitchen table and pulled out a bottle of whiskey I'd never seen before. "Go to bed, Margaret," he said, his voice flat and cold in a way I didn't recognize. "Crying won't bring her back. You're the woman of the house now." I was 7 years old, suddenly tasked with filling the enormous void my mother left behind. By 8, I was cooking meals, though I had to stand on a chair to reach the stove. By 9, I was doing laundry, my small hands raw from scrubbing clothes against the washboard. School became a luxury rather than a right. I would go when the housework was done, which meant I missed more days than I attended. The neighbors tried to help when they could, Miss Evelyn would invite me over to help with her baking, though I knew she was really making sure I got at least one proper meal that day. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks would leave extra vegetables from their garden on our porch, and Miss Ruth, the kind woman I would later name myself after, would slip me pieces of sweet potato pie and books to read by candlelight after Daddy had passed out from drinking. "Your mamma would be so proud of how strong you are, child," she'd whisper, smoothing my unruly hair with gentle hands. "But she'd want you to keep that smart mind of yours growing too." It was Miss Ruth who spoke to my teacher, Mrs. Davis, about my situation. After that, Mrs. Davis began sending homework home with the Brooks children for me. On rare Sundays, when Daddy would go fishing with some men from the lumber yard where he worked, I'd sneak over to Mrs. Davis's house for impromptu lessons. "You've got your mama's quick mind," she told me once, after I'd solved all the arithmetic problems she'd given me. "Don't you let anyone dim that light." Those words became my secret strength, a talisman I held close through the darkest nights when Daddy's drinking turned him mean. He never hit me in those early years. The violence was, in his words, in the way he'd compare me unfavourably to Mama, in how he'd mock my attempts to keep our home together. "Can't even fry an egg right," he'd mutter, pushing away the plate I'd prepared. "Your mama could cook a feast with nothing but scraps." Each criticism cut deep, but I learned to hide my tears until I was alone. At night, I'd often slip outside to sit on our porch steps, looking up at the stars and talking to Mama. I'd tell her about my day, about the things I was learning from Mrs. Davis's books, and how I tried to keep her memory alive by humming the spirituals she used to sing while hanging laundry. "I miss you something awful, Mama," I'd whisper to the night sky. "But I'm trying to be strong like you taught me." On those quiet nights, with crickets chirping and distant train whistles breaking the silence, I could almost feel her presence wrapping around me like a warm blanket. Those moments of peace would sustain me through another day of growing up too fast in a world that seemed determined to break me. The first time Daddy raised his hand to me, I was 11 years old. I'd burned the cornbread, the only food we had left in the house until payday. His palm connected with my cheek with such force that I stumbled backward against the stove, the hot surface searing through my thin cotton dress and into the skin of my lower back. The pain was immediate and blinding, but it was the look in his eyes that terrified me most. There was no remorse, no shock at what he'd done, only a cold emptiness that told me a boundary had been crossed and there was no going back. From that day forward, life in our little house became a dangerous dance of trying to anticipate Daddy's moods, to make myself invisible when the whiskey bottle came out, and to endure the punishments that came when I couldn't disappear fast enough. Most nights I'd wait until his snores filled the house, before tending to my injuries, cooling burns with precious well water, pressing damp cloths to bruises, biting down on a folded rag to muffle my cries when the pain was too much to bear silently. In the morning, I'd cover any visible marks with long sleeves or high collars, regardless of the Alabama heat. Our neighbors suspected what was happening behind our closed doors. I could see it in their pitying glances, in the way conversations would stop when I approached. But in our community, in the 1,950 seconds south, family business stayed family business. The authorities wouldn't intervene for a colored child being disciplined by her father, not when they turned a blind eye to far worse injustices every day. By 1953, as I approached my 13th birthday, the world outside our little house was changing. Brown v. Board of Education had just been decided by the Supreme Court, though it would be years before any real integration happened in Alabama. I would listen to the radio reports about the decision, about the resistance to it, about a young minister named King who was beginning to speak about dignity and justice in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable. One evening, as I was listening to one of these reports while preparing dinner, Daddy came home earlier than expected. He yanked the radio cord from the wall, his face contorted with rage. "Filling your head with dangerous ideas," he growled. "That's what got your mama killed, thinking she was equal to white folks." It was the first time he'd ever suggested Mama's death wasn't an accident, and the implication hit me like a physical blow. That night, as I lay on my thin mattress nursing fresh bruises, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way out, not just for my safety, but to honor Mama's memory in a way that hiding and surviving couldn't. I didn't know then how that escape would come, or that it would arrive in the form of a movement that would change not just my life, but the course of history itself. All I knew was that somewhere beyond the confines of our small house and the limitations of being a young black girl in the Jim Crow South, there had to be more than this. There had to be the possibility of freedom, not just from Daddy's fists, but from a system designed to keep people like me small and afraid. Looking back now, as an old woman who has lived to see changes I couldn't have imagined in those dark days, I recognize that this was the moment when a seed of resistance took root in my heart. It would be years before that seed would fully bloom, but in that moment of clarity amid my pain, something fundamental shifted. I was no longer just surviving until I could escape. I was beginning to envision a different world worth fighting for. And fight I would, though the battles ahead would test every ounce of strength and courage I possessed. As 1960 dawned, I had survived 6 years under my father's increasingly tyrannical rule. By then, Birmingham was a city on edge. The early tremors of what would become the civil rights movement were already being felt, though few predicted the earthquakes to come. For a black girl of 16 living in the shadow of violence, these changes seemed both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close. The day I turned 16, Daddy didn't acknowledge my birthday. It wasn't a surprise he hadn't marked the occasion since Mama died. But this particular morning, he did something unexpected. He tossed a crumpled newspaper across our worn kitchen table as I served his breakfast. "Job listing," he grunted, gesturing at the circled advertisement. "Maid position with the Bennett family. You start Monday." My heart sank as I read the details. The Bennett family lived in Mountain Brook, the wealthiest white neighborhood in Birmingham, nearly 2 hours away by bus. Working there would mean the end of any hope I had of returning to school. "But Daddy," I began hesitantly. "Mrs. Davis said if I can finish this year, I might qualify for." The back of his hand connected with my mouth before I could finish. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as he leaned in close, whiskey fumes heavy on his breath even at 7 inches the morning. "You think you're better than your mama? Too good to clean white folks' houses?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Education won't save you from what you are. Best you learn that now." I started work the following Monday. The Bennett house was an imposing two-story colonial with white columns and perfectly manicured gardens a world away from our decaying neighbourhood. Mrs. Bennett was a thin woman with perpetually pursed lips who inspected my work with a white-gloved finger, pointing out dust I couldn't even see. Mr. Bennett was rarely home, but when he was, I learned to make myself scarce. There was something in the way his eyes followed me that made my skin crawl. The family had 2 children, a girl about my age named Laura, who never acknowledged my existence, and a boy named Thomas, 12 years old and already practicing the casual cruelty he'd observed in the adults around him. He would deliberately spill things after I'd cleaned or hide items and claim I'd stolen them. My days began at 4:30 a.m. to catch the first bus and ended well after dark. The pay was pitiful, most of which Daddy took for room and board, but the job came with one unexpected blessing. Mrs. Bennett insisted I take home their leftovers rather than waste good food on garbage. Those scraps often constituted the only decent meals I had all week. One evening in early 1961, I returned home to find Daddy sitting with a man I'd never seen before, Mr. Lawson, a foreman at the steel mill and nearly 30 years my senior. As I entered, they fell silent, eyeing me in a way that made me instinctively back toward the door. "There she is," Daddy said, his words slightly slurred. "Ain't she something? Looks just like her mama at that age." Mr. Lawson nodded approvingly, his gaze travelling over me in a way that made me want to disappear into the floorboards. "She'll make a good wife," he agreed, as if I weren't standing right there. Strong back for work and childbearing. The realization of what was happening hit me like a bucket of ice water. Daddy was trying to marry me off to a man older than himself. Later, I would learn that Mr. Lawson had offered to forgive a substantial gambling debt in exchange for my hand. I was being traded like livestock to settle my father's accounts. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, thinking of Mama and wondering what she would do. For the first time, I seriously considered running away, though the stories of what happened to young black girls on their own were enough to make my blood run cold. Where would I go? How would I survive? The questions swirled in my mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. The following Sunday, desperate for any guidance, I lingered after church service to speak with Reverend Brooks. He was a kind man who had presided over Mama's funeral and one of the few people Daddy still showed a modicum of respect toward. I confided my situation in hurried whispers, aware that several church ladies were watching with curious eyes. Reverend Brooks's face grew grave as he listened. When I finished, he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "The Lord doesn't intend for a child to be sold in marriage," he said firmly. "Leave this with me, Margaret. Come to the parsonage tomorrow afternoon." The next day, I slipped away from the Bennett house during my lunch break, heart pounding with fear of being discovered. Mrs. Brooks ushered me into their modest home, where I found Reverend Brooks sitting with a middle-aged couple I recognized vaguely from church, the Mitchells. "Margaret," Reverend Brooks began, "the Mitchells' daughter has moved to Detroit for work. They have a room to spare and are willing to take you in as a boarder. Mrs. Mitchell needs help with her seamstress business, which would provide you with decent employment." Hope flared in my chest, bright and painful. "But, Daddy—" "Leave your father to me," he interrupted gently. "There are ways to handle this that protect everyone involved." What followed was a delicate negotiation conducted entirely without my presence. I was told only that Reverend Brooks had convinced my father that my marriage to Mr. Lawson would bring shame upon our family in the eyes of the church community. Instead, he proposed that I would bring more value as a working boarder with the Mitchells, with a portion of my wages still going to my father. Given the choice between social ostracism and a continued income stream, Daddy reluctantly agreed. 2 days later, I moved my meagre belongings, 3 dresses, a pair of worn shoes, Mama's Bible, and a faded photograph of her into the Mitchells' spare room. The space was small but clean, with a real bed, not just a mattress on the floor, and a window that overlooked Mrs. Mitchell's carefully tended vegetable garden. After years of walking on eggshells, the peace of that room felt almost disorienting. Mrs. Mitchell was strict but fair. Under her tutelage, I learned the fine art of dressmaking, how to take accurate measurements, cut patterns, and create garments that flattered various body types. My fingers, already nimble from years of necessary mending, quickly adapted to the precise requirements of her business. Soon, I was not just assisting but creating dresses of my own design, which became popular among the young women in our community. "You have a gift, child," Mrs. Mitchell remarked one evening as we finished a wedding dress for the daughter of a local deacon. "Your mama must have taught you well." I swallowed the lump that formed in my throat. She taught me the basics before, but mostly I just remember watching her hands work magic with needle and thread. For the first time in years, I began to feel something like peace. Though I still sent money home to Daddy each week, delivered by Mr. Mitchell to avoid any direct contact, I was effectively free of his daily torments. The Mitchells treated me with a respectful kindness that felt foreign after so many years of abuse. They insisted I attend church regularly and encouraged me to join the youth choir, where my voice, unused for so long except for necessary communication, rediscovered the hymns Mama had taught me. It was in this choir that I met Nathaniel Hayes, a tall young man with serious eyes and a quiet dignity that set him apart from other boys our age. His father was a Pullman porter on the railroad, a prestigious position that allowed their family slightly more comfort than most in our community. Nathaniel was one of the few young men our age who hadn't already left for factory work in the north, having secured an apprenticeship with a local carpenter. "You have a beautiful voice," he told me shyly after practice one evening. "Like angels whispering." I blushed at the compliment, unaccustomed to kind words from anyone, much less a handsome young man. Over the following months, a cautious friendship blossomed between us. Nathaniel would walk me home from choir practice, careful to keep a respectable distance under Mrs. Mitchell's watchful eye. We'd talk about music, about his work, about dreams that seemed impossible yet worth holding on to. "My daddy says there's going to be changes coming," Nathaniel confided one evening as we sat on the Mitchells' front porch swing. "Says this Dr. King fellow is waking people up, making them see what's been happening right under their noses all along." I nodded, thinking of the radio reports I'd heard, the whispered conversations among adults that would cease when children entered the room. "Do you really think things could be different?" I asked, trying to keep the desperate hope from my voice. Nathaniel's expression grew solemn. "They have to be. Men can't keep other men or women in chains forever without something breaking." By late 1962, rumors of organized protests were sweeping through Birmingham's black communities. Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth were planning something big. People whispered something that would force the nation to see the brutal reality of segregation in the most violently divided city in America. The Mitchells were cautiously supportive of the movement, but worried about the potential for violence. Mr. Mitchell had seen firsthand the brutality of Bull Connor's police force and feared for the safety of anyone who dared to challenge the established order. Sometimes standing up is the only choice left, Nathaniel argued during Sunday dinner at the Mitchells' table, where he had become a regular guest. If we keep waiting for the right time, our grandchildren will still be drinking from coloured water fountains. Mrs. Mitchell clucked her tongue disapprovingly, though I could see the conflict in her eyes. There's standing up, and then there's putting yourself in the path of men who think nothing of turning fire hoses on human beings. The Lord calls for wisdom alongside courage. I listened to these debates with increasing interest. The seed of resistance that had taken root years ago was now growing stronger, though I rarely contributed to these discussions, preferring to observe and absorb. My mind was alive with questions and possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. My relative peace was shattered in February 1963 when Mr. Mitchell arrived home ashen-faced from delivering my weekly payment to Daddy. "Your father's sick, Margaret," he said quietly. "The doctor says it's his liver. He's asking for you." A tangle of emotions knotted in my stomach, fear, residual anger, and an unexpected thread of pity. Despite everything he'd done, everything he'd failed to be, he was still the man who had once swung me high on his shoulders and called me his little bird before hatred and grief had consumed him. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling in long strips like dead skin. Inside, the smell hit me immediately: illness and neglect, unwashed sheets and stale whiskey. Daddy lay on the same bed he had shared with Mama, his once powerful frame wasted to almost nothing. His skin had a yellowish tint, and his eyes, when they focused on me, showed a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "Margaret," he croaked, his voice a dry rustle. "You came." I nodded, standing awkwardly in the doorway, unsure how to proceed. Part of me wanted to turn and run. Another part felt rooted to the spot by obligation or curiosity, I couldn't tell which. "Sit," he said, gesturing weakly to the edge of the bed. When I hesitated, something like shame crossed his face. "Please, I won't hurt you. Those days are done." Cautiously, I perched on the very edge of the mattress, ready to spring away if needed. Up close, I could see how death had already begun to claim him, hollowing his cheeks and sinking his eyes. "I ain't been right since your mama died," he said after a long silence. "Took the best of me with her. That's no excuse for what I done to you." He paused, each breath visibly paining him. "I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I see what I did. Too late, but I see it." Tears pricked at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. This deathbed confession couldn't erase years of pain, couldn't heal the scars, both visible and invisible, that I would carry forever. But in that moment, I saw not the monster of my nightmares, but a broken man who had lost his way in grief. "I forgive you," I heard myself say, the words emerging before I'd consciously formed them. "Not for you, for me, so I don't have to carry your sins alongside my scars." He nodded once, a tear slipping down his sunken cheek. "You got her strength, her heart, the best parts of both of us." We sat in silence after that. the weight of years and unspoken words hanging between us. Eventually, his breathing grew more laboured, and I called for the doctor waiting in the next room. Daddy died 3 days later with me reading from Mama's Bible at his bedside. The funeral was sparsely attended, a testament to how thoroughly he had isolated himself from the community that might have helped him heal. As we left the cemetery, Nathaniel took my hand in his, a public gesture that would have been unthinkable just months before. "You're free now," he said quietly. I looked back at the fresh grave beside my mother's older one. "Yes," I agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. And it's time I figured out what that means. Little did I know that the path to true freedom would lead me into the heart of a movement that was about to shake Birmingham and the nation to its very foundations. The spring of 1963 was approaching, and with it a baptism by fire that would transform me from a survivor to a fighter. April 1963 arrived with an electricity in the air that seemed to vibrate through Birmingham's streets. The whispers had grown louder, meetings more frequent, and even those who had previously kept their distance from troublemaking began to listen with intent when news of Dr. King's plans spread through our community. After Daddy's funeral, I had moved permanently into the Mitchells' home, no longer as a boarder, but as something closer to family. Mrs. Mitchell had formally taken me on as an apprentice in her dressmaking business, and my designs had developed a modest following among the younger women in our church. "You have a future in this, Margaret," she often told me, "a way to support yourself with dignity." But while I appreciated her encouragement, something had awakened in me that couldn't be satisfied by needle and thread alone. The movement was calling its pull as irresistible as a tide. One evening in early April, Nathaniel arrived at the Mitchells' door with unusual urgency. After dinner, as we sat on the porch swing now with Mrs. Mitchell's blessing, though she still monitored us through the window, he leaned in close. "There's a meeting tonight at 16th Street Baptist," he whispered. "Dr. King himself will be speaking. They're planning demonstrations, big ones. Will you come with me?" Mrs. Mitchell would never approve of me attending such a gathering. Though sympathetic to the cause, she feared the violence that would inevitably follow. I glanced back at the window, where her silhouette was visible through the curtains. "Tell her we're going for a walk to discuss wedding plans," Nathaniel suggested with a mischievous smile that made my heart flutter despite the seriousness of the moment. It wasn't entirely a lie. Though no formal proposal had been made, we had begun to speak of a future together, a modest home, perhaps children someday. Mrs. Mitchell, eager to see me settled respectably, had encouraged the courtship, unaware that Nathaniel's involvement in the movement ran far deeper than occasional dinner-table discussions. The church was packed beyond capacity when we arrived, the air thick with anticipation and the mingled scents of pomade, perfume, and perspiration. We squeezed into a spot near the back just as Reverend Shuttlesworth rose to introduce Dr. King. I had seen photographs in newspapers, heard his voice on radio broadcasts, but nothing prepared me for the physical presence of the man himself. He wasn't tall or imposing in stature, but when he spoke, his voice seemed to reach directly into the core of my being, resonating with truths I had always known but never heard articulated so powerfully. "We've come to Birmingham because injustice is here," he declared, his words rolling through the church like thunder. "We are here to remind America of the fierce urgency of now." As he outlined the planned campaign of non-violent direct action boycotts of downtown businesses, sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, and mass marches that would almost certainly result in arrests, I felt a surge of both terror and exhilaration. This was dangerous, potentially deadly work. Bull Connor's reputation for brutality was well earned. His officers and fire department were notorious for their enthusiasm in suppressing even the most peaceful black gatherings. Yet sitting in that church surrounded by people who had decided that dignity was worth risking everything for, I understood with sudden clarity that this was what Mama would have wanted for me, not just survival, but the courage to stand for something larger than myself. After the speech, volunteers were called forward to receive training in non-violent resistance techniques. Without conscious decision, I found myself rising from my seat, Nathaniel's hand clasped tightly in mine. "Margaret," he whispered, surprise evident in his voice. "Are you sure?" I nodded, unable to articulate the certainty I felt. This was right. This was necessary. This was perhaps what I had been preserved through years of hardship to do. The training sessions were held in church basements and private homes over the following days. We learned how to protect our vital organs when being beaten, how to maintain dignity while being arrested, how to respond to hatred with determined love rather than retaliatory anger. We role-played scenarios, taking turns playing demonstrators, and police practicing how to go limp rather than resist arrest, how to shield our heads from billy clubs. Mrs. Mitchell discovered my involvement after the first weekend of demonstrations began on April 6th. A neighbor had seen me among the protesters at a department store sit-in and reported back with concerned disapproval. "Have you lost your mind, child?" she demanded when I returned home. "Do you have any idea what those policemen will do to you? What they do to our girls especially?" I met her gaze steadily, finding a courage I hadn't known I possessed. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I do. But someone has to stand. If not me, then who?" Her eyes filled with tears as she pulled me into a fierce embrace. "Your mama would be proud," she whispered, "and terrified just like I am." From that day forward, the Mitchells' home became a quiet hub of support for the movement. Mrs. Mitchell sewed armbands for demonstrators and prepared sandwiches for those doing jail support. Mr. Mitchell used his delivery truck to transport protesters to and from demonstration sites, careful to vary his routes to avoid police surveillance. The true test came on May 2nd, when the youth marches began. Dr. King and his advisors had made the controversial decision to include children and teenagers in the demonstrations, knowing the national outrage that would follow if young people were arrested and jailed. Though I was nearly 19 by then, I joined the youth contingent alongside Nathaniel, who had been appointed a group leader because of his calm demeanor under pressure. The morning dawned clear and warm as hundreds of us gathered at 16th Street Baptist, receiving last-minute instructions and encouragement from movement leaders. We sang freedom songs that lifted our spirits and steeled our resolve. "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Turn me round, turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to Freedom Land." As we prepared to exit the church in orderly groups of 50, a young minister I knew as Reverend Abernathy addressed us. "Remember, no matter what happens today, you are fighting for your dignity, for your future, and for generations yet unborn. Walk with pride, meet hatred with love, and know that the eyes of the world are watching." I was assigned to the third group, led by a Howard University student named Sarah Jenkins.